Okay, well, wonderful to have you all here this afternoon. I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Ngambri and Ngunnawal peoples, who, along with other First Nations communities, have endured European invasion and lived on these lands for thousands of years. I pay my respects to them and to all those who live modestly on country as carers and custodians. This event was made possible by funding from the Research School of Humanities and the Arts, ANU, and I'd like to express my sincere thanks for their generous support of both this event and Rae Armantrout's visit to Australia. I also want to thank Julianne Lamond, Ros Smith, and the staff of the School of Literature, Languages and Linguistics, ANU, for their invaluable support. Unfortunately, our ANU English colleague Amelia Dale is unable to chair today's session due to COVID, but my heartfelt thanks go to her for all her efforts in organising this event. And for those of you who don't know me, I am Monique Rooney. I teach and research in the English program at the Australian National University, and I co-direct the Centre for Australian Literary Cultures, also known as CALC, with Julianne Lamond. CALC is a research centre focused on raising the visibility of Australian literature both locally and internationally through an interdisciplinary approach that connects scholars worldwide. In this spirit of promoting international literary dialogue, I'm delighted to introduce today's conversation and reading between two exceptional poets, Rae Armantrout from the United States and Kate Lilley from Australia. US poet Rae Armantrout has published more than 24 books, mainly of poetry, but also of prose. I've been reading her book True today. Rae's distinguished body of poetry includes Finalists, 2022, Wobble, 2018, Partly, New and Selected Poems, 2016, Just Saying, 2013, Money Shot, 2011, and Versed, which won both the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry and the National Book Critics Circle Award in 2010. Her latest book, Go Figure, has just been published by Wesleyan University Press. Australian Kate Lilley is a queer poet scholar and adjunct associate professor at the University of Sydney. And Kate's influence in bringing avant-garde US poets into the curriculum has been far-reaching. Her acclaimed poetry collections, Versary, 2002, Ladylike, 2012, and Tilt, 2018, have earned her widespread recognition, with Tilt winning the Victorian Premier's Award. Kate is also a scholar and editor, known for her editions of early modern writer Margaret Cavendish, The Blazing World and Other Writings, Penguin Classics, 1994, and selected poems of her mother, Dorothy Hewitt, UWA Press, 2010. Rae and Kate will be in conversation for about 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A session. Please feel free to type your questions in the chat at any time, and we'll address as many as possible during the Q&A. You'll also have the opportunity to unmute and speak directly. But for now, please keep your microphones on mute. And please note that this session is being recorded. As I said, it will be uploaded to the Calc YouTube site at a later date. That's it from me. So over to you,
Okay.
Rae and Kate.
Thank you, Mon. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land. I'm delighted to be here. Sorry I'm not there with Rae in person, but circumstances have conspired. But it's actually not a bad way or not an inappropriate way, given that mediation is one of the sort of overriding concerns of Rae's work. The sort of thoroughgoingness of mediation and in the languaging of the world. I thought it would be a good way to start to just have Rae read a group of poems from her new book, Go Figure, because I think there's nothing better than that than to just hear the poems. And I know that many of you will not have read them, but you can, at least sort of take them in to some extent, and then we'll sort of start talking around those poems. So Rae said I should choose what clump or cluster she's going to read. So she's going to read, I think it's 7 poems to start us off. And if you know Rae's work, you know it is characteristically short. And she is a mistress of the magic of the short poem, her phrase. Magic is her phrase, not mistress. And yeah, so we'll start that way and just hear from Rae first. Thanks, Rae.
Thank you, Kate. I want to say first, thank you to Monique too and Amelia for bringing me. I was enjoying my visit very much, but then my husband got COVID. I may have it. I don't know. My throat's kind of weird today, and I might cough a little. I tested negative, but whatever. Don't need to go into that. I just wanted to tell you that it's possible I'll cough. Anyway, okay. At the moment, I need a moment, a taut, equivocal poem, another chance to practice my balance, one foot against my inner knee and both arms out. Sun still on the wisteria. The question is, how still? Now, hop. Child's play. When she speaks for the bubbles, she uses falsetto. Oh no, they cry as they leave the wand. Oh no, already in air quotes. Escape velocity. Out the window, lilacs, lavender swag, above long leaves, split down the middle, as we are. Mirror image at the core. Matter and its opposite number. Bad actors, both. Can't handle intimacy. But here we are, comfy as hell. Oh, and this next poem, Fractal, was actually in the magazine Scientific American, which, believe it or not, has a poetry column. Fractal. If I were made of homunculi, the way a cauliflower head is made of little noggins, would I be gorgeous? Like this green one, a field of rockets, each nippled with hard cones. And I do have an ongoing interest in the sciences. And this poem starts with a quote from, I think it was the biologist Nick Lane that I came across. Simply, we're molecular machines operating on energy freely available from such sources as thermodynamic processes. It sounds so benign when you put it like that. Our earliest ancestors were accelerants. They ate change. Where does that leave us? Do I believe that formulating a problem in the starkest possible way while making strange and conspicuous word choices is helpful? What if the answer is no? Ladybug, ladybug, fly away home. Your house is on fire. Your children. Narrative. Scattered against dark conifers, the seared gold trees, I take for signal fires. You too. What do you think they're saying? In fiction, time runs both ways, and the past is legible, harmless. Question: how are beauty and meaning connected? Beauty seduces meaning, meaning stalks beauty. Beauty breaks down into meaning, meaning breaks down into dreams. And lastly, forests. Grotto of letter clusters, grove of keys. Do I believe there's safety in numbers? In number? AI spells death to truck stops and their gift shops packed with lonesome doodads. How rhythm once defined distance, I mean domesticated it. Each neuron broadcasts its call sign. Plaintively, until another homes in and a synapse forms. Woody bark covers the shoots.
Thank you. That's great, Rae. It's great to hear you read them. I mean, I think I think you could do this sort of, start most places in the book and go for a bit and, get that sense of the kinds of things that are at stake in your work and the kinds of recurrent interests and but I chose that bit because I thought it in a very neat way sort of introduced a lot of your characteristic poetic gestures. The rhetorical question, or the question as an aside. Sometimes the whole poem is a question, sometimes it's a whole stanza. The way that you sort of move between sort of proposition, question, rarely answer, but and that's sort of engineered or cut through with these very striking, colloquial, sort of often jokey words that, to use your word, ping, like doodad, or comfy, comfy as hell. And one of the things you said to me when we were having a bit of back and forth about sort of, how we might do this was that when I asked you what often gets left out, because everybody writes about, for good reason, everyone writes about your, the sort of, markedly intelligent, propositional, thinky sort of character of your work, markedly sort of intellectual, but emotion, affect tends to, sort of get left out. So why don't we start there and thinking maybe, with some of these poems.
Okay, yeah. I like that question. It's true, I think, that people often talk about, say, the ambiguity of my work, how to make meaning out of it, how meaning might be problematized, which are all intellectual problems that are very interesting to me. I like your word proposition, Kate. One thing I like to do is to throw out a proposition that may or may not be true, could, conceivably be true, and then pose examples of what it might mean, what it might look like for that to be true. And often the examples are problematic somehow. It's like they're chunky, unwieldy pieces of the world, and how do they line up with these propositions that I'm trying to use to describe it? So, having said that, I would like to get around to emotion. Since I don't talk about it much, I may not be good at talking about it, but I can tell you that every poem of mine starts with a feeling, and usually with a feeling that I can't identify. Maybe because it's complicated, kind of a compound feeling of ironic yet wistful, let's say, or sad yet angry, or some combination of feelings. But also maybe I just don't understand the source of the feeling. And that's where a poem starts, is where I try to run that down and look into it and try to identify the source of the feeling. And I could talk about that with, let's say, maybe with Child's Play, which is the one. I do have granddaughters. They're 7 now, but this was probably written when they were more like 4, maybe.
And they're twins, right?
They're twins, yeah, twin girls, and they're blowing bubbles outside. And because they're around, I don't know, they're around a lot of literate people, so they sometimes pick up a lot of phrases that they, may not totally understand the register of. But so in this case, "Oh no" would be one of those. When she speaks for the bubbles, she uses falsetto. So she's blowing bubbles, and you might think of that as a very carefree, fun thing. And, she does have fun. They do have fun with it. But she says, "Oh no." And I'm not sure what that means to her or where that comes from. But, no doubt it's a phrase she's heard somewhere else, and it's just coming through this situation. "Oh no," they cry as they leave the wand. "Oh no," already in air quotes. So I guess the reason that seemed emotional to me, because that's a thing that happened, right? A lot of my poems are actually things that happened, things that I saw, in fact. And I guess I saw that, and I heard that, and it made me feel, both interested and sad, kind of. I mean, why sad? Not because she was saying "oh no," and not really for the bubbles because they might pop, but for something else. I guess for the way that the language was both meaningful and not. That always gets to me. Somehow it does something to me. The way that "oh no," it was playful, and yet underneath the playfulness, there is a sadness there.
And I think this is a very characteristic move of yours, the doubled "oh no," which is both a transcription, of the scene. "Oh no," they cry as they leave the wand. "Oh no," already in air quotes. So the first one, which sort of doubles up the negative and the leaving, is melancholic. And the second one, "oh no," already in air quotes, is ironic.
Yeah, it's almost funny, huh? So you're right. Yeah.
This dyad, or this conjunction of the melancholic and the ironic, it's like it's a little allegorical scene. It's like a primal scene, isn't it? And often, I think you're in that sort of territory, but to sort of say it like that makes it a bit, I think sort of, there's always this lightness, which of course is coded in the bubbles, and a lightness that is at risk, is going to burst. Oh no. So that sort of risky lightness, or the lightness that lasts, but that has a kind of miraculous quality, it has a magic. I think, that's a kind of, it becomes a little sort of epitome or little allegory of, the way you often do short poems, but trying to sort of get away from the sort of the risk of sententiousness or being too heavy-handed. So I think sort of "comfy as hell" is another, sort of gets that kind of, don't, that kind of look out, don't get too snoozy with this. Don't think you know everything that's happening, because there'll be these shifts and this movement, but it's also like a picture. So it's like a picture of movement. So it has that sort of tableau vivant kind of character, I think. And I know, that's sort of one of your something, you know, that's often talked about in relation to your work, that not just sort of, and I think this is where it gets sort of, and I haven't quite sort of worked out how to deal with this, that as soon as I start to think of any aspect of a poem of yours or of your work, every other aspect comes rushing in because it's all happening all the time and at the same time, but all in these bubbles, these compressed, lightly made. So I think this sort of the figure of, to come to the word figure in your book, go figure. It's not just about this poem, not just about bubbles, how bubbles are, but blowing bubbles, the making of bubbles.
Yeah, I see your metaphor. I see where you're going.
What's yours?
Yeah, but you're making the metaphor that the poems themselves are like these, especially if they're short, are like these bubbles.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And so I think it gets to, and that it's called child's play, this sense of, or, serious play, I guess, in your work generally, and the sort of the light juggling, but also the kind of bubbling, the bubbling of things. I think somewhere in one of the interviews you talk about, I think it's where you're talking about sort of your interest in physics, and I understand nothing of physics, but I get except for I can come at it sort of metaphorically, but this sense of a kind of rumbling or something going on, that poetry is a great vehicle for, or that poetry can kind of get things going as well. It can recognize things that are going on, but also sort of do its own stuff, get it happening. Go figure. So, I mean, I think are your twin granddaughters, are they identical twins?
I don't know for sure because they look alike pretty much. I can tell them apart, but they look a lot alike. But they weren't tested at birth,
Right.
And they had different placentas, so it's an open question.
Well, that's perfect.
But they look a lot alike.
So, I mean, it sort of leads me on to the poem that follows Child's Play that you read, Escape Velocity, which ends, here we are, comfy as hell, goes into this, further into this sort of question of mirror imaging, doubling, echoing, that is so powerfully present, certainly in this book, but I think, in your work generally. And in Escape Velocity, this poem, you are moving between a description, a kind of imagistic description of the lilac leaves split down the middle as we are, mirror image at the core, matter and its opposite number, bad actors both can't handle intimacy. There's so much going on in those lines. And I guess coming back to emotion, I mean, we associate lyrics with intimacy. That's that's characteristic. Lyric is thought of as an intimate mode and I-you mode. But I think in your work, you could call them, I'm sure somebody has called them this, meta lyrics.
I don't know if anyone has used that, but someone has called them anti-lyrics.
Yeah, I don't think they're anti-lyrics at all, though they maybe have aspects of that. But I think they're always meta. But the meta is not, I think this is very sort of Ashbery. They're not, I think that produces a different kind of intimacy. It's not the enemy of intimacy.
No. I always want to have it both ways.
Yeah.
You
And you do. A sort of thoughtful intimacy, or a thinking about intimacy, or thinky intimacy.
I like the way you phrased it at the first. You were talking about I can't remember exactly what you said, but something about bilateral symmetry of the leaves, and how that is both, of course, there's a seam. I'm thinking of lilac leaves, but a lot of leaves are this way, with a seam down the middle and then the mirror image sides, right? So that's bilateral symmetry.
Yeah.
And so it's like a mirror image. And then matter and antimatter, if you don't know, also have that kind of mirror image symmetry, where the charges are where one has a positive charge, the other has a negative charge. And you've probably heard that if two atoms, one matter, one antimatter, come together, they mutually self-destruct. They destroy each other. So that's a kind of negative, I guess, bilateral symmetry. So there's a positive one in lilacs. I haven't really thought about this before, but I'm just riffing now that you brought it up. And
Yeah.
Matter antimatter one. And then we get down to people, and I don't know whether these people really are a couple, maybe, sitting on the couch, or twins. One thing I see a lot with the twins is how much they fight. And what little things they fight about, or just a civic population tearing itself apart, maybe. But so yeah, that's what I can make of it.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking of the 2-page spread is like kind of bilateral symmetry. And your poems tend to be in these columns that mirror each other very, closely. They're not identically, but you often do sort of turn the page and get sort of look-alike poems in front of you. That sort of takes me to the idea of the material you're working with in forests, and the grotto of letter clusters, grove of teas. Do I believe there's safety in numbers, in number? So that very sort of precisely achieved, the shift from in numbers to in number, and there's a double space between those lines, and the second, the repeated in number, or almost repeated, there's an S dropped and there's a question mark added. That too is a very kind of characteristic, and that comes just before one of your little breaks, which you mark with a just an underscoring.
I just want to throw in really quickly that I mean, I do break, but I do a kind of asterisk as a break when I turn the manuscript in. But they somehow never want to use an asterisk, so they do this divider they came up with. I don't know
what they
why,
do.
Anyway, I do use some kind of divider, yes.
Would you rather it was an asterisk?
Maybe. Well, I don't think it matters much, but that's the way I do it.
Yeah. And so, I mean, sometimes you do use numbered parts.
Yes, sometimes I use numbers. I use numbers when I feel like the break is larger, but we can get to that later.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something going on with, again, something that presumably you do kind of by feel, sort of just feeling for when you want a numbered sequence, or when you want an asterisk, or a,
right,
like when you want a double space. Yeah. And you do, certainly reading your poems and hearing you read them, because it's all happening in even if the poem itself, some poems are shorter than others and sort of more miniaturist than others, but I think the technique is always miniaturist.
Mm-hmm.
And so things are happening in this sort of pinpoint way, a letter dropped or a question mark.
Yeah.
Difference between the space between adjacent lines and a line dropped down a little further. There are all these sort of ways of distinguishing sort of the space of the poem, the mise en page, that are doing things with these small increments, sort of making them do things.
I like the way you brought up the difference between their safety in numbers and in number, because we were talking about twinning and doubling, and that's an almost double, almost twinning, but it's also very different because safety in number is a kind of cliche. It's a common saying, safety in numbers. Like when you want to herd together with other people because there's a danger out there, or maybe you want to take the same conformist view that other people have because you don't want to stick out. That's having safety in numbers. But then in number, so that has one tone, that has a colloquial tone that is and then in number is completely different from that. It has a serious tone that's not talky.
Yeah, and safety in number is poetic, sort of obviously, not idiomatic. It's the skewing or the swerve. Hank Laser describes your work in terms of lyric swerve. So that's one nice little example of that. Just a kind of détournement, a little wobbling, turning, all these sort of different ways you can characterize that. And I sort of think like wobble is a U word. And what I get out of that is, again, it picks up on this idea of balance or precarious balance.
Yeah.
But also a sort of shimmering kind of quality, sort of there, not there. And that there, not there, absent presence, toggling, maybe brings us to another topic that we thought would be a good one, or that you liked, of the uncanny.
Yeah. I love the way you were just describing my work there. I was thinking to myself, yeah, that's perfectly good. Right.
It's good
just the whole way you described it there. I loved it.
Well, I feel like I get it.
I think you do.
But this, I think there is no uncanny without some sense of the canny. But I think in your work, that's really strong.
Yeah. I think there's something haunted about the space between what you know and what there is to be known. And that could be even as literal as you know that you're in a room alone, but suddenly you get the feeling that you're not alone. Maybe you hear something in the room, and it's behind you. And so there's that kind of uncanny where there's a gap between what you thought was happening and what might be happening. And I think that in that, what could happen. So I think that in that gap is a lot of where the uncanny starts. And also think, familiarity, the kind of familiarity that comes from doubling, right? Like this looks alike, but not quite, is uncanny too. So uncanniness has something to do with the relationship between familiarity and strangeness.
Spooky.
I haven't exactly worked out what it is, but it's in that area between familiarity and strangeness.
Well, in narrative, the poem before Forest that you read, that was one of the ones you thought of in relation to the uncanny. And the second section of that, it's a sentence. In fiction, time runs both ways, and the past is legible, harmless. And then the next bit, question, how are beauty and meaning connected? Beauty seduces meaning, meaning stalks beauty, beauty breaks down into meaning, meaning breaks down into dreams. So you're using the rhetorical, well, in Renaissance rhetoric, that figure is called gradatio, the stepping. So you end, the word that ends the line is the first word of the next line.
I didn't know that. Thank you.
That's in Putnam. I think gradatio, or the stepping stone, I think he calls it. And there are other, but that, so in one sense, it's a grammatical and line by line, stepwise enacting of sequence, this, then this, that's kind of, a way to speak of narrative. That's what narrative is, this, this. But you've already said in fiction, time runs both ways and the past is legible, harmless. So the kind of implicitly, what follows, I think, is the question, how are beauty and meaning connected, is addressed to poetry. Poetry's not
necessarily harmless.
Not like fiction, not harmless, not legible, maybe in the same way.
Right. I think it, like when we were talking about the canny and the uncanny, it has to be partly legible. It has to be canny to some extent. I think at the end there, where meaning breaks down into dreams, of course, dreams, if this went on, then the next stanza would start with the word dreams, but since it doesn't, dreams just kind of hangs out there, and it seems like a step into the unknown, I guess.
Yeah. And you often do that hanging ending, which I think is a sort of way to grapple with this risk of sententiousness. I remember someone saying to me long ago, who was not a poet reader, but had just read some poems, and said to me, why do these poems, and they were all lyrics, end with this sort of thud? why do they, really, what is this thing with the last line? And ever since then, I've sort of had a horror of that, or, just a sort of, am I thudding along? But thinking of the one before, simply, do I believe that formulating a problem in the starkest possible way while making strange and conspicuous word choices is helpful? What if the answer is no? Ladybug, ladybug, fly away home. Your house is on fire. Your children. So your children just hangs there. No, the other lines are end stopped or end with.
Yeah, well, I stopped it there because that is, of course, I think a familiar kind of nursery rhyme, and like many nursery rhymes, it's actually very grim. So it really goes, your house is on fire, your children will burn. But since I thought it was familiar, I thought I could just leave it off and just direct the reader to look towards the children and go, what's happening there? What's going on? Are they in danger? Because there's a lot in this poem, of course, about not a lot, actually, just a little about fire. Our earliest ancestors were accelerants. And there's and accelerant is the word accelerant, of course, it means to to go faster. And now there are some people who want to, on the right and on the left, who think that they should push society into collapsing so that out of the ashes their kind of new world can arise, and they're called accelerationists, although I'm not sure I was thinking about that. I think the usage I was thinking of when I said accelerant are that when arson investigators investigate a fire to see if it was arson, they see if there was an accelerant there like gasoline on the floor. So, that's the simplest meaning of accelerant. So our earliest ancestors were accelerants. They ate change. The change as in thermodynamic processes. I guess that, to try to explain all that would be kind of technical, but it has something to do with fire and with even if it's a slow fire, the fire of digestion, the fire. I mean, life is fire, really. Life is a contained, slow fire.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of, there's a slow burn kind of quality to the book, and there are a lot of explicit sort of image clusters and word clusters that, that's why I say it's sort of it's very cohesive in all kinds of ways, but certainly sort of at the level of language. You feel like you're in its own sort of bubble or echo chamber, and there's also a lot of referring to other things, either things that are just sort of, like you say, cliches or well-known bits of language in the world, or bits that you draw attention to, often in a sort of, there's a sort of jokey, a sort of passing pleasure in these sort of fragmentary bits drawn in to this, but it's all sort of burning.
Yeah, there are a lot of poems in the book that much more explicitly than this refer to fire. I mean, there's even a poem called Fire.
Yeah.
And then there's Flame, and I think it's because I live on the west coast of the United States, but you're in the same situation here in Australia, of course, where we've had so many huge wildfires. Right now, there's one that's burning right up to the northern outskirts of Los Angeles, that's already put a lot of people and homes in danger. And I've been in fires. I don't know if we want to go off on something autobiographical, but I've had ashes falling on my head, and I've been in heavy smoke where it's hard to breathe. And one time I was just in my house by myself without my car, and because my husband had my car, and all of a sudden on my cell phone there came a warning that said evacuate immediately. And so I went outside. I'm looking around. I don't see fire, but I can smell it, and I know there's fire somewhere. And I'm going, how would I evacuate? What? Then it turned out that was a mistake. Then another message came on, and it said not Everett, which is where I live, really this other one, which is a little further up the hill. But so I've been close to fire.
That sense of sort of looming disaster, which is sort of strongly thematized in the book. And one of the poems I think is called Disasterville, right?
Oh yeah, right.
And in one of them you sort of take use figuratively the La Brea tar pit. In LA, this bubbling tourist attraction next to the LA County Museum. So it's a kind of, that juxtaposition works well for the kind of world of your poetry, I think. But I think also, it sort of points in the direction of this, when you say fiction runs both ways, I think maybe the idea of poetry here in the book is that it's kind of immemorially deep, and you often use creations of various kinds. You use Genesis, and have done, variously. So there is a sense, and you often sort of use images of or figures of sort of geological time, and that sort of cross cuts with the threat of imminent disaster, or perhaps
right, the end and the beginning, huh? The alpha and the omega.
And I think it's so you often, for instance, use Edenic. There are very explicitly poems taking up the story of the garden and the loss of the expulsion from Eden and so on, and I think
like Further Thought has something to do with I guess with Genesis. I mean, at least the beginning of it, the poem Further Thought. I was raised in a religious house. At least my mother was religious. I don't think my father was, but my mother dominated that sphere. So I was raised reading the Bible, going to church, in a kind of evangelical, church. And so that does. I mean, I'm not religious. Sometimes people, friends of mine even ask me about my use of the word God and say, "Do you believe in God?" And I keep saying, "No, not in a God you could pray to, not in anything Judeo-Christian or anything that you could give a name to. I think when I use the word God, I just kind of mean everything we don't know, sort of WTF, is my God." But so that comes very naturally to me, that sort of harking back to the Genesis story or other stories, other creation myths.
It seems
to mix them up with cosmology too, and with the physicists' attempt to come up with a theory of the beginning of the universe.
I mean, it seems like it's part of your repertoire, and as you say, it's associated with your early life, your maternal. So I think I think one of the, and I think you don't know as a reader without being sort of like, I didn't know till I read you saying that that you weren't religious, because it's unusual to have that going on when you're not, I think.
Probably.
So but I think it's very interesting that you use that material. Like I say, it's part of what you've got.
My tool set, right. Well, I think that's why I'm interested in science, because it's just another way of trying to conceive of, how we got here, how things started. When I was a little girl, I used to be fascinated by, and just as when I was a child, by the idea of space, and that how could there be an end to space, but also how could empty space go on forever? And so things like that would just drive me crazy thinking about them. And religion supposedly kind of answers those questions, but if you don't have religion, then what? Then the questions come back. And so then that's why I started reading books about physics and cosmology. They don't really have answers either. They have answers, but they don't have answers that they're sure of. I mean, the answers change, which is good. I mean, it's good when answers can change.
Well, I love the story you say that in various interviews that you're sort of you were explicitly sort of drawn into poetry when your teacher gave you the Untermeyer anthology.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But clearly, like all this evangelical stuff, for instance, that's all grist to your, it's all extremely poetic. And so, kind of along in this sort of developmental narrative, if you like, and there's a whole sort of developmental narrative going on in the book about your twin granddaughters.
Mm-hmm.
There's this, you're putting together across not necessarily in a narrative way in the book, or not obviously, it's all sort of happening, or there are narratives embedded in the book, but there are other narratives that can be extrapolated, I think, from it, and that are no doubt, at least to some great extent, private. And you talk about privacy, or you write sometimes about privacy, and one of the things I think that's so interesting and curious about lyric poetry is that insofar as it kind of courts or produces a certain experience of intimacy, it's equally an assertion of privacy. Like,
yeah,
you can't know. Your attention is sort of drawn to what you can't know, but in that space of not knowing, something else can take place that is crucial to. I think it's certainly crucial to the love of poetry. If
I do too. I
if
mean,
poetry,
sometimes people ask me if I know the whole way a poem's going to go, if I know the end or where I want to end when I start, and I usually answer that if I knew that, I wouldn't start at all. I would.
What would
It's
be the
not
point?
about certainty. It's about the absence of certainty. That's what draws me in.
There would be no fun in it.
No, there'd be no fun and no point.
So, I'm aware that it's 5:30. So, Mon, I don't know. Should we let other people's questions in around now?
Sure.
I knew that this would
Yeah,
happen, that we would start talking somewhere and then we would just keep talking about that.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, so thank you both for that really interesting, wonderful conversation. So you can either put your hand up or unmute right now. Put your hand up first, or even put a question in the chat. It's up to you where to start.
I'll jump. Yeah, I'll jump in. Just following off on Kate talking about fun, and I just wanted to sort of ask about humor in your work, Rae, because in some respects it's not always ironic, but I feel like it's sort of like, is that shift in terms of the intimacy that Kate talks about can be a shifting, like a sort of seeing up a sort of a remove a bit, but it's also kind of is always making us not sort of feel like anything's fixed, that the humor's often the turn, or a little sort of questioning. So I just was wanting to sort of ask you about that.
First of all, hi, Anne.
Yeah.
Hello. We were in touch in the past. Yeah, I think that the humor is often the place in the poem where doubt comes in. I think you were sort of implying that, where I'm maybe punching a hole in the narrative that I'm reciting, or that I'm developing, and sort of suggesting there might be another way to look at that. So I guess it is a place for a turn. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's often a thing where you play the straight man.
Yes.
Without investigating that phrase too strongly. It's cutting. There's a kind of cutting.
Yeah.
I mean, in Australia, we would call that laconic. I think your poetry is very readable within an Australian idiom, I think, because that structure of humour is like our one.
Oh, well, that's good. It's mine too. And I liked something that you said right at the beginning of your remark, but now I've forgotten it already. I'm a little sick myself, so that's my apology if I'm incoherent. But
You're not in the least.
oh, straight man. How could I forget that? Yes, straight man. I've thought of myself sometimes as doing voices, so that my poems don't have one voice, they have several voices. And one of them, I guess I've never thought of it in this way, but could be called a straight man. I sometimes think of it as a sort of faux expert voice, that I'm sometimes putting on as if I knew more than I do. And that's like the straight man. And then there's the skeptic, sometimes presenting with humor, that pops up and starts poking holes in the straight man or the faux expert.
I have a question off of that, and going back to something you said quite early in the conversation, Rae, about whether something's meaningful or not, as a question that sort of drives you, I suppose, or that also is at play in your poems. And I guess when I've listened to you in interview and thought about your poems, it seems often it's explicitly to puzzle out something, as you say, scientific. But I'm just wondering, and in relation to the poem narrative, what that means in terms of fiction, and also where poetry is in relation to fiction or fact, and also meaningful or not. I know that's probably a very big question, but
yeah. Can you cut it down just a wee bit?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess in that poem narrative, in fiction, time runs both ways. So is poetry fiction?
I don't think so. Maybe some people's poetry is fiction. I don't think of mine as fiction. It's something else. I do think that there is a kind of arrow of, not all fiction is the same, of course, but in a lot of fiction, and certainly in classic fiction, there's a definite arrow of time. It's experimental when there isn't. So there's an arrow of time and causality that's caused by the arrow of time, so that you get an event here causes something here, causes something here. And poetry often, if you look at sort of the classic idea of the lyric poet, it takes sort of a moment, one glimpse, like what Ezra Pound said about the Imagist poem is it's what can be glimpsed in one moment. He said more than that, but that's my brief summary of it. Or one intense moment between two people. That's the kind of the classic idea of the lyric poem. So it's more of a stop time. Now, I don't think I'd be interested in only having that, but I think that for me, I've got a bunch of different sort of freeze frames, if you will, and then I'm juxtaposing them. That's one way to look at it. But at least I don't think that it's a sort of A causes B causes C kind of movement that you might find in Thomas Hardy or anyone like that.
Yeah, so I was just thinking about the faux expert in relation to that, because if I think of a faux expert, I'm thinking of a professional in the and so the poet is not a faux expert.
No, it's a character that I sometimes play in my poems. The straight man, the faux expert. Not always, but
Yeah.
sometimes
the
when I'm
poetry is also
quoting or paraphrasing science, but also just when I'm talking about things that no one could possibly know. Like, for instance, in the one called Further Thought, which is called, the beginning part of it is called Genesis 2. So I'm rewriting Genesis, right? When words first had meaning, so there's meaning again, that lasted, that hung in the air after their occasions had dissolved, it was eerie. I get that. Words were gods, arbitrary, deathless. So I'm talking there as if I was there and as if I know exactly what it was like, to be hearing words that came from nowhere, came from God, came from bushes, whatever, burning bushes. Not every bird or bush would talk, but the idea that any might was palpable. So, and of course, I'm not just talking about Adam and Eve, I'm talking about early humans, right, who first had language. But then who knows what it was like for them? I'm making that up, obviously. So in that sense, I'm kind of a faux expert.
Well, the early modernist in me particularly loves all that stuff and makes me think of Bunyan of the Pilgrim's Progress, where pilgrim is sniped by words and literally knocked down on the path by words and knocked into.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think the poems are conspicuously expert.
Yes.
They have a dazzling virtuosic, and everyone remarks on this. It's like a fact about them, and that is there to sort of marvel at and enjoy. There's a kind of look at that,
Thank you.
done with so few words, and that's the magic trick kind of thing, that you talk about of the short poem. But it's also, I think, and this maybe takes us into, we haven't sort of explicitly mentioned anything about, and I kind of like it that we sort of haven't mentioned objectivism or language writing, because it is.
Yeah, or I threw in a little bit of imagism, but not much of that.
Because it does tend to, it can just sort of flatten out everything. But I think, just to not too much get into those sort of movement designations, but just that sense of, word as thing, poem as object, is obviously very strong, and much kind of remarked upon by the poems themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's something that's going on in this question of, well, it brings us back to allegory, I guess, because, there's narrative there, but as I was saying before, it's like a picture of narrative. So it's like framed, or, and there's movement from bit to bit and sort of movement in the parts. But there's also a sort of very strong sense of this sort of achieved object status.
I think in a way I was a little bit making fun of that, you might say, in that first poem that I read at the moment, where and it references a poem, right? I need a moment, a taut, equivocal poem.
Yeah,
so
right.
That's a sort of description of my own work, and then another chance to practice my balance. So balance was one thing we've talked about. One foot against my inner knee and both arms out. So that's a kind of comical, pose. And then the end is now hop. So you could, if you want to just literally picture the situation that the speaker is in there. I mean, if what I say I want is to be standing with one foot on my inner knee and my arms out like this and hopping. So I guess that's having a little fun with my
Yeah.
balanced poem.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me of or some of the poems remind me of the kind of ashbury you get in paradoxes and oxymorons, which I always used to love teaching that poem, and most students didn't like it at all because they didn't want to be, like to be talking about paradoxes and oxymorons. They wanted it to just sort of do it or something. Well, of course, it did do it, but that meta quality, which is maybe, I don't know, do you feel like, over your kind of, this amazing span of all these books, the sort of, do you feel like the shifts are sort of just book to book between these kind of narrative poles and lyrical or objectivist kind of poles, or do you feel like that the same, you're working with the same kind of stuff, or do you feel like, like the balance shifts across your work, or it's not like that?
Yeah, that's a hard one, really. I mean, I think there's something the same in all my books, but I'd like to think there's some growth too. I mean, I know for sure that my interests or my preoccupations have extended across a lot of books, and yet the actual things that come up as material, the actual images, are often different because circumstances in my life are different. Now there are the granddaughters, and now I'm living in the Pacific Northwest, a little bit north of Seattle, which is very different from living in San Diego, which is where I spent most of my life. So there are different plants, it's a different circumstance, different weather. And then, different historical facts, I mean, such as the Trump presidency, shall we say. So all of that changes sort of the face of my poems, but then I think there is something that's the same, too, from the very start.
Yeah. Is there another question up, or?
There isn't.
I wondered if you'd like to read the title poem, Rae. Go figure.
Oh yeah, sure. It's one that has numbers. You mentioned that. I think I'll read the numbers. I don't always, but I think I will now. Here I go. 1. Here I go again was a rock anthem once. Crowds on their feet, mouthing the words. 2. There's no way to explain how faultlessly I want to write about how pointless all this is. Nothing I can point to but the gesture itself, the way it comes to seem anachronistic, spectral, like this ongoing attempt to catalog the world by latching each thing to the last memory it calls up. Nothing recalls the new Cat 6 haboob. 3. But I'm hard to discourage. When a branch lays out 5 like an old card trick, identical white orchids, 3-petaled light sails spread, ready to go, each with a small bat face in the middle. I wanted to say first, but then I forgot what a haboob is, because you probably won't know, but it's a giant sandstorm. And I think it's an Arabic word, though it could be a Bedouin word, but it was picked up by the media in Southern California to describe the giant sandstorms that had been occurring in Arizona. And there were, I don't know if it made it over here, but there were some really striking pictures of gigantic walls of blown sand towering over, say, Tucson or Phoenix. And I guess it was a kind of a newish phenomenon, so I just latched onto that, but exactly because of its unfamiliarity. But then I end up explaining it like this after I read it.
Yeah, I looked it up.
Yeah.
I think of course now everybody you just Google,
Yeah, that's true.
So you have your assistant, or one of your poems thematizes the echo assistant. But here I go as the opening poem of Go Figure. It's the envoy to the book, and it's a Genesis kind of deal.
Yeah.
It's the sort of creation. It's referencing that kind of ex nihilo, although of course it's not ex nihilo because this is your 20th book, and or something like that, and the world, it's in the world, as you say, you're in the world, and the world goes on.
Kate, there's a question from Bridget Vincent. Do you want to unmute, Bridget? Just because we're getting close.
Yeah.
Thank you. Such a wonderful discussion. I was just wondering if I can follow up on that poem and the sense at the end that you're leaving something unsaid is sort of one sense that I get at the end that seems to be in parallel to what's happening with your house is on fire, your children beat. And I was just wondering if you might say a little bit about how that unsaid moment plays into your thinking about, how poetry kind of captures a particular kind of thought, because it seems it's just fascinating. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I think that and this is something that in a very different way Lynn Haginian wrote and thought about too. The question is how to end a poem when you know that you can't and don't want to even say everything. You do trying to present a completed picture of anything is both pretentious and also, if you could do it, it would be very suffocating. So yeah, I know what you mean. This is just kind of my solution to that problem. And in this case, I think it's kind of left open grammatically as well as psychologically. So there are these, there's been this discussion of disaster, but I'm hard to discourage. And then I see these white orchids, identical white orchids, kind of like cards laid out, 3-petaled light sails spread. So a lot of orchids have 3 petals, right, on top. And then one kind of tongue-like one beneath, ready to go, each with a small bat face in the middle. I mean, that could be the end of a sentence, but it's left open, because I guess we're going to go with these light sails, make the orchid petals into sails and take off. You could only do that if you're Tiny Tim, of course, but that's kind of like this zany escape idea that you're going to sail off with the orchid. The fact that it has a bat face in the middle is, that I guess that's what Kate was talking about when she said, not ending it with something sententious, but instead, with something a little bit funny, a little bit unsettling.
Well,
your escape pod has a bat face in it.
This is a good cute.
Thank you.
And Ngai uses one of your poems as an example of cute in her aesthetic categories, doesn't she?
Yes. Yeah.
And so this is a cute move, I think, but it's also a great example of your layering of a kind of figurative layering. So you got the branch of the orchids, I mean, there's a lot of mixed metaphor going on here.
They're cards and they're orchids, and then they become sails.
And you've got some kind of cross species.
Well, this was all based on looking, of course, as I always say, at a real orchid that we had at our house. And it had, if you look at very many orchids,
just had a bat face.
Sometimes they do have things that look like faces in the middle. They have various patterns in the middle, markings, and sometimes they could look like a kind of a face. This looked sort of like a bat face.
Yeah, it's like pansy faces. That way of talking about the faces of plants is. But I think because it's within this, like Anne was saying, there's a sort of lightly humorous intermixing, kind of playful intermixing, that, I mean, you are sort of using techniques of producing lyric beauty there, but in a sort of, I wouldn't say exactly, maybe comic, is not too strong a word. The reveal, the bat face is a kind of punchline. Got a little jokey, what's this? Here's the bat face at the end of it.
It's a quirky element thrown into. But I mean, I am drawn to beauty. I mean, I admit it, but I didn't want it to come off like beauty was the solution to everything, that we should just stop with beauty, I suppose.
Was anything tuned? I think
it's getting very close to the end. It's almost 5 to 6, and Rae's voice is sounding.
Well, I think we could all say goodbye unless someone has one more question. My cough is kind of kicking up, so.
Well, I'll say as my closing thing, just wanted to mention your phrase, go on your tone, which is, of course, a jokey rewriting of O'Hara, go on your nerve. And tone is an often, a word that contemporary criticism doesn't have much time for. But I think it's interesting and maybe due for a revival in some new way. I just was I think there is something very interesting about your handling. I mean, you talk about sort of different voices, and another way to say that are these different tones or tonalities that you're handling, getting going.
I agree with you. Tone is kind of a new a word from the new critics, and they, of course, fell into disfavor. Although, I still think that they're close reading a poem, maybe not exactly as they did, but still close reading a poem is really the way to read a poem. You have to look at all the words and talk about the relations. And
it's the last thing you'd expect from a language poet to be talking about tone. So I like that. That's got its own inbuilt frisson to it, Yeah.
I don't think you can get away from tone. Every single thing that a person says in conversation, everything a person writes has a tone, and it's not insignificant. I don't think you can get away from it. I mean, this has come out before, but there are some ways in which I am dear friends with many of the language poets, and there are some ways in which their ideas, our ideas, are still important to me. But I don't agree with everything that was the consensus back in 1976. Time moves on.
On that note.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Kate, and thank you, Rae, for that excellent discussion. There's so much to think about. And thank you, everyone, for coming.
Yeah, thanks
Thank
for
you.
coming. Thanks for having me.